DeQuincy Meiffren-Lezine is a suicide attempt survivor who has been active in suicide prevention since 1996. He received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from UCLA and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Rochester with a focus on public health approaches to suicide prevention. Dr. Meiffren-Lezine was the inaugural chair of the Attempt Survivor and Lived Experience Division of AAS and has served as co-chair for the Consumer Survivor Committee for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Dr. Meiffren-Lezine was awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award at the SAMHSA 2015 Voice Awards. He is the director of the Lived Experience Academy, an internationally recognized scholar, and a published author.
All right, fortunately for me, I have the privilege of going in the afternoon so that you have already heard a lot about the science, about the research, about a lot of the programs that are available nationally, internationally, and locally. So I get to put a lot of that into perspective now. I know when I've been going to conferences over time, I often have tons and tons of notes, and I get back home and wonder, how am I supposed to put this all together? What can I implement when? And how do I organize all of this great information that I've had? So I'm going to try to provide some ways to think about all the information and how it fits together into a story. So today I'm going to talk about suicide kind of as a demystified thing. A suicidal crisis path, so how somebody moves from a baseline where they have absolutely no risk up to where they might have really serious suicide risk. Safety planning as a major crisis intervention, ideas of recovery and resilience, and a lot of concepts related to that, especially within the context of suicide, and then post-traumatic growth after we have a suicidal crisis. All right, so I'm going to start here with suicide compared to quality of life. I think of suicide as being something that happens when somebody has a perspective of life that is now at the point where they feel like it is not worth living. So when they are comparing the amount of pain and suffering, the amount of rage or the amount of conflict, the amount of loss that they are currently experiencing is no longer at the area that they would say I have a quality life, then they might consider suicide. Right? So let's think about what happens that gets somebody all the way up to the point where they are possibly seriously suicidal. Right, so at the baseline, we might say that this could happen when somebody is very young. It could happen when somebody is much older. So baseline for this is the kind of overall status quo of their life as they have normal variations in the quality of life. At some point, what might happen is based on their biology, based on what's happening in their mind, based on what's happening circumstantially, it pushes them over to having higher risk. This morning we heard a lot about things that might contribute to somebody having higher risk. If they are at a point where they are developing one of the major mental health conditions, if they are developing depression or bipolar disorder, if they're experiencing the first stages of psychosis, a lot of those things will push somebody to the point where they are now at a higher risk state. So a lot of times when we look at lists of risk and protective factors, some of those are going to be things that identify people who are now at a higher risk. So they're more like risk markers. The people who are in those categories, who we say have a higher risk of suicide, people who we say have a higher likelihood for suicide, they are the ones who are now in that higher risk category. At some point, there might be something that occurs that pushes the person into the suicidal category. This would be what was talked about this morning as precipitating events, or possible things that people have talked about while they're on the hotlines. Right? So usually, as we heard, when somebody calls the suicide prevention hotline, now 988, they might talk about the circumstances that they currently have, how they perceive those circumstances. If it is about family, it is about their social setting, their friends, their amount of acceptance or non-acceptance, personal rejection, how they are doing in school, if they're feeling bullied, if they're feeling ostracized. A lot of those are going to be the precipitating events on the outside. Then you also hear from people how they are feeling on the inside. So that's when they're talking about that pain, that hopelessness. They're feeling helplessness. They're feeling of being a burden onto others. They're feeling like they want to belong somewhere. They want to have a social group that they are accepted with, either just a one-on-one relationship or with their family relationship, or kind of a broader school or friend group, and that's being thwarted. It's being stopped. Those are all going to be internal parts that somebody is experiencing that takes them from possibly having a higher risk into being in the suicidal category. Now, when somebody is in that suicidal category, they're now considering suicide. That's when we would want them to call the helpline. Right? That's when we would want them to go and see a counselor. We would want them to talk to somebody. That way they don't move on to having a suicide attempt. This is one of the major crisis periods, and that's why a lot of the interventions for suicide prevention focus on this particular period of time. A lot of that, the cognitive behavioral therapy, the DBT, a lot of those interventions are geared towards when somebody is in that either high-risk period moving towards suicidal, or if they're in the suicidal period and you're trying to keep them from moving on to having a suicide attempt. Now, I put separately suicide attempt and suicide to emphasize that when somebody is at the point of possibly attempting suicide, that's not our last chance to rescue somebody. There's still a moment in between suicide attempt and when somebody dies by suicide. This is one of the main reasons why having access to lethal means being something discussed is important. I would say that if I had access to a gun, I would not be here. If at any time that I had been suicidal in the past, I had access, then I would not be standing here. The time period when risk is at its highest, most intense point is often not something that lasts for a really long time. The entire crisis period can last for a long time, but the peaks when somebody might take action are often not that long. It could be minutes, it could be hours, possibly days, but oftentimes really, really short. So having somebody not be able to immediately act on those urges is something that allows them to have the time and allows us the space and time to intervene and to keep them from moving on that pathway from suicide attempt over to suicide. Another reason why I separate it out is to point to something else that sometimes we don't necessarily think about. This morning we heard some about variations in the geography for the differences in between states, within states, for the rates of death by suicide. Now, part of that is the number of people who are attempting, the number of people who are trying to die by suicide, but another part of that is whether or not somebody who has attempted or is about to attempt is able to get help and how quickly and how effectively that help will be. Somebody who takes a lethal dose and is in ready access to an ambulance, ready access to a hospital, has a much higher chance of surviving and thus being a non-fatal suicide attempt than somebody who took the exact same amount, the exact same timing, but lived in a rural environment where it's going to take a long time for the ambulance to reach them. It's going to take a long time for them to be able to get to care. And perhaps they're not going to have the same access to life-saving care as somebody who might be in an urban setting. So attention to those types of details provides an additional layer of where we might be able to make a difference in somebody dying by suicide compared to somebody who has attempted suicide but was able to stay alive. All right. Okay, so this takes me to talking about 5 possible intervention points. The first one is in between baseline and higher risk. And that's where we find our prevention and wellness promotion programs. The ideals there for something like the good behavior game, something like a lot of our wellness promotion activities, health promotion activities, is to prevent people from ever moving on to having higher risk. That's why it's useful to approach all youth, all kids. It's also so far early in the trajectory that it will have a possibly major impact, even if it's just a small amount, a small dose of prevention activities. It's also something, because it's so early in the trajectory, that has the potential to stop a wide variety of negative health outcomes, because a lot of them might start from that same initial trajectory of risk. The next stage then is early intervention. So somebody already has a higher risk. They've developed a mental health disorder or a substance use problem, and we want to stop them from becoming suicidal. This is where we see the protective factor of access to treatment, of successful treatment, by medication or by something like a peer support program. That stops somebody from possibly moving from just having a higher risk category to where they're actually considering suicide. Next up is this clinical and crisis intervention. So at that point, somebody is already suicidal. But the point is to stop them from attempting suicide. I had somebody once who I was chatting with ask what he could do to not take action on his suicidal thoughts. And we went through a number of things that he could possibly do, people who he could possibly call. And there was a lot of, no, I can't do that. No, that's not accessible. No, that's not ready. And so after a while of doing that, I asked him if he could just go to sleep for a while. And he said, yeah, sure, I could do that. Right? No problem. Doesn't take a lot of energy or effort, doesn't take a lot of resources. I can sleep for a while. And I said, well, that's one of the great things that you could do, because suicidal thoughts is not going to kill you. Suicidal action kills you. You can live for a very long time with suicidal thoughts. Some people have chronic suicidal thoughts. And you find ways to cope with it, you find ways to ameliorate it. But the thing that injures people is the action. So as long as you can keep people from that action point, the better the chance that they will never die by suicide because they never attempted suicide. And then that last part there is the difference between somebody attempting suicide and dying by suicide, which I talked about a moment ago in terms of their emergency rescue. And when I talk some about emergency rescue, I talk about 2 different aspects. The one that I mentioned earlier was about our intervention itself, right? How fast people get it and how effective it is. The other part, the one that usually gets talked about most when we're talking about access to means, is the person's actions, right? How lethal it is and how fast that is going to happen. There were some notes earlier about whether or not people switch up the means that they have or the means that they are thinking about for dying by suicide. And I can say personally that there were plenty of times where I considered different types of means, but for different purposes. Each one had a connection to me for a particular idea or a particular thing that I was trying to get rid of. But in each circumstance, I had a very strong attachment to that method. So blocking that made a big difference because, for one, I would have to think about a whole new thing, and then that gives you time. And we remember that the high-risk time is usually not that long. So providing even that bit of difference in the time that somebody takes action can have a major impact. But the other thing is you are breaking the thought process that is moving just straight towards death, because now there are hurdles in the way. And there weren't a whole lot of times where I would think about being blocked from one way, immediately going on to something else. But I did mention that there are 5 intervention points. The last one is here, is after the suicide. The people who are then exposed to that suicide, this is their closeness to it either physically because they discovered the person who has died by suicide, they are responding to it as a first responder, or somebody who is emotionally close to the person, because that is something else that is going to have a significant impact or can have a very significant impact on the person, especially if they identify with the person who has died by suicide, and if they identify with either the method or the type of pain that they were experiencing or the things that they were talking about in any of their communications going forward. That is now something that will contribute either to their higher risk, or if they're already at higher risk, it can contribute as a precipitating event. And that's when you get something like a cluster. Right? Also, at sometimes called suicide contagion. Because the suicide has now acted as a precipitating event for somebody else who is at higher risk. And if it doesn't happen right away, and most of the time it doesn't, it has now contributed to their potential risk in the future by being something that has elevated them into that higher risk category. So that provides our 5th intervention point, and that is the postvention as prevention. Let's talk then about the interventions that might stop somebody from suicide. Again, we have that status quo. And if somebody has become suicidal, it's dipped below that quality of life to such a degree that they are considering life not being worth it anymore. And a crisis intervention will block it from going all the way down. Just having the crisis intervention by itself does not really bring somebody back up to the top, but it does stop their trajectory from going down, which is a very pivotal point. But I wanted to note that even though it has stopped the trajectory going down, having the crisis intervention just by itself, that being the only thing, has only temporarily stopped their trajectory. They're still at that dip. It's a very important pivotal point, but it can't be the last point that we have for people. This is one of the main interventions. It's the safety planning intervention. It's kind of a brief and helpful therapy. There's a plan that people take home. This was originally created for use in the emergency department. The late Barbara Stanley often would say that she wanted to emphasize it's a safety planning intervention, not a safety plan. The plan is part of it, but the act of creating it and the act of reviewing it and using it, that is part of the intervention, the vital part of the intervention itself. They found that the quality and use over time led to this being really useful for people becoming less suicidal and having better follow-through. I'll circle back to the importance of the quality and use over time as we get towards the end, but this is part of why the planning part of it is so important. In the original article where they described the safety planning intervention, they talked about sitting with the person and going through the different aspects of it, and the process of walking through the different aspects of it helped the person to review their own suicidal path and help them to identify what might be happening that could help them in the future. And the process of them doing that was part of the intervention itself. Okay, so I knew that you wouldn't be able to read the small print there for the safety plan. You can look that up at the safety planning website. I believe that there are links to that. But I wanted to show just kind of broadly what we're talking about here. In the first part there, individualized warning signs. Now we go through lots of lists of possible warning signs that people might have. You might find those at the SPRC website or at the AAS website or other places that say, here are possible warning signs that people might display. Here are things you might see, here are things they might say, here are things that they might be experiencing that they might share with you. But what we want to do here is to look at their individual ones. So for this particular person, what are the things that are going to show up? What is it like for this person as they get to the point where they are moving from that higher risk to being suicidal? That way they have a chance to note what their trajectory is like, and thus know when they might be able to take action so that they never reach that suicidal point again, so that when they're feeling that higher risk elevating, they can take action to bring that down. The second part there is individual coping strategies. Some of these initially are going to be distractions. So it's if you are by yourself, what can you do either internally or out in the world that can distract you from those suicidal thoughts? Part of the reason why distraction works, again, is because the timelines. As long as the person can get through that period, either by distraction or by something else happening, the greater the chance that they are going to be able to ride through that suicidal storm. Eventually, though, you would want those coping strategies to include more than just distraction. So earlier, there was a brief mention of like the dive reflex, which is what happens with the ice water, somebody putting their face into ice water. There are a number of distress coping skills that come primarily through dialectical behavioral therapy from DBT principles that have been found to just being able to have those few distress tolerance skills, helping somebody to get through those really intense suicidal moments. That being one of them. Others you can see at the nowmattersnow.org website. There, they talk about a particular view of the suicidal crisis like being on fire or in a fire. and what can you do, just a few simple things that you can do to help somebody through that experience. Things like maintaining eye contact, staying with the person, having them really get into their sensory awareness so that it brings them out of that inner experience and out to something that is more tangible and is often just simpler. The next one there is social coping strategies. That's when we start to engage other people around us, again with more of a distraction. But now it's not just you, now it's with the person who has perhaps come to spend time with you. Again, if somebody is there and present, besides eye contact, there can also just be activities. And this could be really simple activities. It doesn't have to be like a friend who you're talking to about the crisis situation, about what's happening internally. It could be something as simple as, hey, let's go see a movie. But even though it's not specifically about that suicidal experience, it's still something that can have a big impact because it distracts from it. The next one there, people who you could ask for help, that is friends and family providing crisis support. Those are the people who you would be able to talk to when feeling that heightened risk period, feeling like you need to talk to somebody. Those are going to be the people who fall into that category. They should be trusted people and people who perhaps could have helped you to fill out or to improve your safety plan. People who are identified who specifically might be called on in the event of somebody feeling more suicidal. Some of the versions of safety plan, particularly ones that I've seen that are developed into apps or ones that are developed a little bit more into forms, such as the ones that were originally created with the Wellness Recovery Action Planning models, have the person along with their phone number or email contact or something like that, so that way it's all together, not just who they would contact, but how they would contact them. And so it just puts all together so that the person who is currently helping them or them themselves will have easy access to making those contacts happen. The last part there for people to contact is the professional crisis support. Now that's 988. It will also be the person's individual therapist, or if they have a prior experience with crisis stabilization program, or it could be whoever's going to initiate that mobile crisis response. It could be the school support. That is going to be listed in that area. Oftentimes for the safety plans, they will already have pre-filled out something like a Lifeline or 988, so that is always available. But we would want to encourage people to also put in additional resources that they have to contact professionals. This also provides an opportunity if you are doing the intervention in the emergency department or some other clinical context to be able to link people up with care if they don't already have somebody in the community that they can access for care. And then the last step there is the specific means restriction plans. That's that counseling for access to lethal means. That's talking to family. That is talking to the person themselves in terms of getting rid of that specific method that they are thinking about or the ones that they have considered in the past. So then quick review for the community roles that people can have, because we do want to emphasize that it's not just clinicians that play a role in somebody preventing suicide. So for mental and emotional help, that's the self-help aspect. That's that first part, identifying those warning signs, individual warning signs. The second one is also a little bit more self-help. That's identifying those coping strategies that somebody can take even when they're by themselves. And then we get the potential roles for friends, for family, and for people in the community that can provide distractions. After that, there's mostly friends and family who would be asked for help during a crisis. So you can see there a difference between those two, the distractions which could be anybody in the community, again, regardless of whether or not they are crisis trained or have even any idea about there being a crisis happening, versus the friends and family who could take specific action. Then community health resources, and then finally, again, we loop back around to friends and family for identifying and taking action to make the environment safe. So go back here to the quality of life versus suicide to show this other option beyond doing the crisis intervention. This is the recovery path. We're bringing people back up to where they have decent quality of life. So beyond just doing the crisis intervention, the next step we really want to have is for them to rebuild the life that they had, rebuild that quality of life that they feel had been lost, and the thing that made them feel originally like life was no longer worth living. This helps to restore the idea that their life is now, again, worth living. So we'll talk some about recovery-oriented outcomes. I have these two individuals here who have just gone through a major national disaster or local disaster. I originally created this picture when I was living in Oklahoma. And we had tornadoes come through every year, multiple tornadoes each year. And people were left with the devastation and asking, what do we do now after this has happened, after it's already come through? The suicidal crisis acts as that type of traumatic event. The first possible outcome is post-traumatic stress. This is the really clinical outcome where somebody has had the trauma, and as a result of that, they are at a lower level of quality of life, and perhaps that becomes something that lasts so long and is so disruptive to their life that it becomes a disorder, and then they get the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. But a lot of people, even if it never becomes a disorder, will still have some degree of post-traumatic stress. Recovery is getting back up to that baseline. So let's say these people have rebuilt their house. At that point, it's a degree of recovery. Right? They had a house, it got lost, they rebuilt it. For thinking about recovery after suicidal crisis, I like to go to this dimensions of wellness model. It's explored some by SAMHSA, but also explored by a lot of other places. There was a study a little while ago that asked people who had attempted suicide how much their needs were being taken care of by the services they were receiving. And usually what they found was that the psychiatric symptoms were being dealt with. The mental health care needs might be dealt with. Possibly, there were people who were talking to friends and family, but almost universally, the things that were not being addressed were things that were just basic needs, social needs, reintegration into the community. A lot of the basic human needs that somebody would have were not being addressed by our care systems, by our treatment settings. Part of the recovery process of getting back to what would be considered quality of life involves recovering all the different aspects of somebody's life. And one way to kind of think about what those different aspects are is to look at it in this dimensions of wellness model. So the emotional health is kind of those perceptions. Physical health is the capacity. So just kind of physical capacity. This could be, especially if somebody has attempted suicide and has sustained an injury, this might be the physical recovery aspect to it. The spiritual health is just their belief systems. We know that there are possible protective factors of somebody's belief systems based on their culture or based on their faith traditions. And recovering some of those or building some of those would help with their overall recovery. The social health is those tangible social supports as well as emotional supports. Financial is those basic needs. This was something that is often not necessarily talked about. This is something where possibly if somebody was connected to social work or connected to a more bigger continuity of care after a suicide intervention, they might have those basic needs taken care of, but a lot of people don't have that. Occupational is just purely their employment. Environmental is their living space. That is not only in terms of their access to lethal means, but in terms of their living space overall being something that's supportive of their quality of life. The last part there is intellectual. That's being able to think clearly. When I did a large-scale survey with college students and asked them what was really important about mental health care, one of the things that came to the top was not necessarily, I don't have any more symptoms. It was, I can think clearly, because that was something that is going to be important for classwork, for working with friends, for just being a participant in the community. That is something that is really severely impacted when somebody is starting to have the prodromal or early symptoms of schizophrenia or psychotic disorder. They can see the clarity of thought going down, and that is something that is experienced as a very painful realization that clarity of thought, their just ability to grasp onto reality is something that is being taken away. Having attention to the clarity of thought, not necessarily just the symptom management, but how well they can kind of integrate with and deal with just the reality around them is going to be something that is very important for the person's sense of self. Resilience is more about the ability to bounce back after a crisis. I have these two folks here who are doing exercises. I don't know how many of you might have had physical therapy at some point in time, but I've had to do it multiple times, and almost always they give these elastic bands, right, that are used to re-strengthen things, and they have different colors and different lengths and such. And the whole purpose, though, is for you to strengthen those muscles that were involved in the injury. Not necessarily just healing the injury, but to strengthen them so that you are able to better work with whatever was causing the injury to start with. So I think of resilience as the ability to recover. And it's kind of like a muscle in that initially the recovery time period and the amount of effort that it takes to recover might take a long time, might take a lot of effort. Somebody's brand new, experiencing and learning coping skills, different strategies. But over time, that can be strengthened. As they have more coping strategies, as they have learned more from their therapy or from other settings, life skills settings, what happens is that it's faster and easier for them to recover. So for example, at the start of my more suicidal time periods, it might take me a few days to move from the lowest point of feeling suicidal to feeling like, okay, life can kind of continue. But over time, that gets faster and faster to where it could be just within 5 to 10 minutes. Feeling it, experiencing it, and then taking action to recover from it. So faster and faster, I think, is one way to think about resilience, is how quickly somebody can recover. Something to think about, though, is that we've had this risk orientation for the longest time in terms of quality of life and suicide. And we have to ask if risk is going to be the focus forever. Because sometimes we say, well, we want to make sure that we are assessing for suicide each time somebody comes in. And we do want to make sure that they're safe, but we can't keep that as the focus for the entire time. If you think about running a race, imagine running a race, and you're doing pretty well, and you trip and you fall. And as you get back up, you hear the crowd chanting, and you're thinking, oh, they're encouraging me, right? Yay, keep going. But as you listen closely, you hear them saying, don't fall again. Don't fall again. That's not really going to help you to win the race, right? You fall, you get back up, you recover, you might check and see if you have any scrapes or bruises, but then you want to get back into the race. You want to keep going. You want to head towards that finish line. We don't want to only focus on the person's risk of falling again. The other example that I give is driving. I had to drive over from Fresno to here. Imagine if I spent the entire time looking in my rearview mirror or spent the entire time worrying about my brakes. That's what we're doing oftentimes in clinical intervention. We're focusing so much on the braking and so much on looking in the past that we forget that the way that you continue life is by shifting gears and moving forward. You can't focus on risk forever, even though it is important. But what does happen if we focus on risk very exclusively, or just in terms of our clinical interventions? Right? The constant attention to risk elevates the anxiety and stress. I remember getting to Fresno after moving from Oklahoma and starting new clinical care. And the thing that I was the most anxious about was the first meeting that I would have with my psychiatrist and my therapist, because I knew that that was going to be one of the most painful hours of the week, where I would go through an entire interview of what was wrong with my life and how everything was terrible and what was terrible in the past and what symptoms I had currently. And I understood the reason for it, because that would be the way that you identify the medication that might be useful or the therapy that might be useful. But knowing that I had that to look forward to, just reviews of the pain, was something that made me really reluctant to go in and get care. And then after I did, if I felt like that was just going to be the thing the entire time, each time I come in, we're just going to focus on this horrible stuff, that's not going to be something that is beneficial for my health, my healing, or my recovery. But the chronic elevation in stress does lead to things like anxiety. It can lead to depression, problems with sleep, problems with memory, and difficulty with concentration. And as we look at this list of things that can happen when stress is elevated for so long, you can see things that are also listed on the list of risk factors and warning signs for suicide. So one of the counterproductive things that happens if we keep people on this state of alert is that we're actually increasing some of their risks for suicide. So we have to ask, what is our focal point? And I love looking at this compass. Imagine suicide as the south part of the compass. And we say, we don't want people to go south, right? But there's all kinds of ways to not go south. They could go east or west or southwest or southeast, and any of those achieve the outcome of not going south. However, if we say, go north, you're guaranteed they're not going south. Because in that direction, it's impossible to also be going south. So if that's suicide, that's life. Somebody's pointed towards life, absolutely not thinking about death. I call my wife my North Star. From the time that we started dating, she was my north. It was an attachment to life that was so strong that I didn't think about dying because I was purely thinking about life. That hadn't really happened before that. All the suicide prevention programs and interventions had been telling me not to go south. And I did a really good job at going west or east for my kids or for other things. But it wasn't until I had a north that I felt really solidly not suicidal. So this is why I switched to focusing a lot on life promotion and growth promotion as suicide prevention. Thanks. So then let's switch to talking about quality of life and hope instead of quality of life and suicide. Now we're pointing up above the initial quality of life line. So let's return to our couple. There has been a tornado that has come through and has wiped out everything. We talked about their resilience. Now let's talk about their possible growth. Now, initially, growth might just be, I have a house. Hey, let's improve my house. I'm going to make a second story. I'm going to improve the attic or the basement. Nothing has happened bad to the house. So then it's just growth. So that's like when somebody has decided that they're going to start an exercise program, and it's not because they got injured, it's because they just want to be healthier. So then there's post-traumatic growth and post-suicidal growth. That's when the trauma has happened, and then somebody learns from that and moves forward. So in Oklahoma, it was, if your house has been wiped out by a tornado, this time when you rebuild your house, you also build it with a storm shelter because you have learned from the experience and you improve the house that you're making based on that experience. I have a pine cone here because it is one of my very favorite examples of post-traumatic growth. There are some pine cones that only open during a fire. It's only time. And the reason why is because that is their best opportunity for that type of tree to grow. When a fire has come through and has wiped out all the other vegetation, all the dried vegetation, all the things that might prevent it from taking seed and growing, that's when they have the best opportunity to grow. But it goes beyond that. There are some trees, such as our giant sequoias and some of the Pacific redwoods as well, that have adapted to fires so that their initial growth is very fast, and the way that their roots and the way that their trunks are structured is made to be more fire resistant. So in some ways, those trees have learned many ways to adapt to the multiple fires that were going to happen in that environment. To me, that's like post-traumatic growth. It's not that you can't have growth without trauma. It's not that you can't have wonderful growth without trauma. But it is that there are some types of growth that happen after a trauma that might not have happened if that hadn't occurred. So for me, it starts with reflecting. That's the way that we initiate this type of post-traumatic growth. And I have this initial setting here. I love doing art and painting. And the reflection of the city in the water would be great for art. That's one level of reflection, and there's a subtle beauty to it. But if you wanted to really take a look at yourself, you wouldn't do it in a river or a lake. You might do it against glass or something else that's going to give you a closer reflection. Right? That wouldn't be a great way to do a painting of the city. It's a whole different purpose for reflection. And then we go a further step. Right? This person would not want to be putting on her makeup using the reflection in a pool or a piece of glass that's out on the street. They want to focus in a different way. And so there's a different type of reflection. Now it's a close mirror. Maybe it's even a magnifying mirror. And again, you wouldn't use that type of reflection for the purpose of something like doing a painting or doing some broad view of reflection. Different purposes, different types of reflection. So talking about reflection and growth then. When the reflection leads to thoughts about the overall experience or a philosophy about life or kind of a general gestalt impression of the crisis, a re-examination of the life mission or values, these are the types of reflections that might lead to growth. There's an evaluation of the self and possible life lessons. So this is a lot like that couple that has experienced that traumatic tornado that came through, and they reflect on what happened, reflect on how they survived it, and then build on that. So some science, though, right, about post-traumatic growth. What does lead to post-traumatic growth? We kind of know what it entails, but how do we get there? There's an initial coping with the trauma, and it happens after recovery. In the defining of post-traumatic growth, they specifically say that it's a return back to pre-trauma functioning that happens first. That's that recovery aspect. You can't just fall. You can't just stop after falling. You have to get back up, and that's the first stage of moving on to growth. And then there's finding meaning and benefit. I was recently recommended to read the book, it's on finding meaning. And that being something that is significantly important in somebody having life. There's a certain learning that creates change then beyond the pre-trauma level. You found that there is something possibly meaningful or beneficial about the experience that has happened, and extracting that meaning leads to thinking about what can be learned from it, and then taking action on that learning to make changes that move somebody beyond that initial level. You can tell that somebody has experienced post-traumatic growth based on the transformation or qualitative change in their functioning. So part of it is about how well they're functioning, but part of it is about the quality of it, that qualitative aspect of it that is now different after the trauma has occurred. And this is like when I say that there's great things about an apple tree, but that's not a post-traumatic growth type of tree. There are also great things about a sequoia, and that one is post-traumatic growth. It could be qualitatively different. Let's look some at post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic stress disorder. Remember, we talked about post-traumatic stress and possibly disorder as being some of the negative outcomes that can happen after somebody has experienced a trauma. This was a study that was done with cancer patients. Post-traumatic growth had a positive correlation with post-traumatic stress. Now that might be kind of counterintuitive, right? You grow, but then you also had really significant outcome from the stress. And what this says is that the trauma had a high impact. It made a big difference. But that doesn't mean that it only had a difference in one direction or the other. It could have a big difference in both directions. But having growth moderated the connection between experiencing post-traumatic stress and their quality of life and their depression. So you have two groups, and they have both experienced this trauma. They both experienced the stress from it. They both experienced symptoms based on the stress. But for those who then find meaning and create growth from it, they don't get as much depression, and they have a better quality of life. Without experiencing that meaning and that growth, people might go on to have the types of depression and lower quality of life and disruptions that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. But we want to note that post-traumatic growth, it helps, but not necessarily by decreasing the symptoms. It helps because it changes how somebody is thinking about and using their trauma experience. This was a study on strength of character and post-traumatic growth. It's Peterson et al., but it's Peterson with Seligman, who is one of the founding fathers of positive psychology. They looked at character strengths measured by some of the strengths inventories in connection to post-traumatic growth to see if there are any character strengths that are helped along by experiencing post-traumatic growth. And what they found was all the character strengths can be correlated with post-traumatic growth. That goes back to what I was saying about the period of reflection that's initiated by the trauma that can lead to somebody experiencing growth. And the growth is more global. It's kind of that gestalt view of, okay, let me take stock of my life now that I have experienced this really possibly life-threatening trauma. The particularly high character traits were on kindness, on bravery, gratitude, hope, and religiousness. As we look at the character strengths that were really strengthened by post-traumatic growth, it's probably easy to see how finding meaning from a trauma might lead to these being elevated. You might also note that a lot of these will correlate with our protective factors and with the things that stop people from going on to die by suicide. But now we ask, can post-traumatic growth follow after a suicidal crisis? This was a book by Paul Quinnett. He's a friend of mine for a long time, Suicide, the Forever Decision. Paul Quinnett was the creator for QPR, Question, Persuade, Refer, for those who might be familiar with that program. This was one of his early books, and he wrote to the person who had attempted suicide, "I hope that your suicide attempt can be an opportunity for a new start, a rebirth." It's his feeling that the more we learn about dying, the more we learn about living. And when we have learned more about both, maybe we are better able to fully live all of the life we have left. We both agree that there's possibility, special possibility, for types of growth that can occur after a suicidal crisis. Now let me talk about how that goes back to the reflection. On the left-hand side is the type of post-traumatic growth that I have been talking about. On the right-hand side, I have what I call post-suicidal growth. So going over between the two, right, post-traumatic growth focuses on the overall experience. I had possibly died. Now let me take stock of my life and look around and see what is going to be important or meaningful to me. On the post-suicidal side, you are looking specifically at that crisis experience. Yes, I almost died. How did I almost die? And what happened there? Now, some of that is going to be what we are already working with the person on when we're talking about safety planning, right? Remember, those first couple of aspects were about going back over what those individual warning signs were, what the individual possible coping strategies were. A lot of that then is grappling with the crisis experience itself. So we have a start for post-suicidal growth already. On post-traumatic growth side, it's philosophy about person's life in general. On the other side, it's information about the person. Who am I? What do I believe in? On one side, it's a gestalt impression of crisis in general. And on the other side, it's details of the specific crisis that a person had. On the traumatic growth side, it's the life mission or values, more broadly speaking. And on the other side, it's the critical beliefs and values. What was it that was so important to the person's estimation of quality of life that when that was taken away or it felt like that was blocked, it almost made the entire quality of life disappear? What are those critical beliefs and values? On one side, we have the evaluation of oneself, capabilities, strength, and virtues. And on the other side, we're going real deep in focus. We're talking about their personal risk and protection, their personal priorities, how they define quality of life, and what relationships were affected when the person had their suicidal crisis. There's two aspects then to looking at the relationships that were affected. On one side, we have the possible negative outcomes, that risk that might occur after a suicidal crisis because others have been exposed to this new suicidal crisis. On the other side, there are also some relationships that might be strengthened as a result because people come closer together, they have examined what went wrong, and there might be a reevaluation of what relationships are important, which ones to prioritize, which ones ended up not being so helpful, and which ones somebody might want to seek out in the future. So here's my quiz. Here's a question or quote. If it's, what is my life purpose? Is that post-traumatic growth or post-suicidal growth? That one is more like post-traumatic growth. It's general life purpose. But who are the people I couldn't stand to lose? That's post-suicidal growth, because it's very specific to that individual and very specific to that person moving forward. What are my critical values or beliefs? Again, that's post-suicidal. Life lessons you could get from the crisis experience, that's more post-traumatic growth. And that's okay to stay at that level, right? Not everybody has to delve into their crisis experience. There's just different things that can come out of it. I can't believe I got through all of that might be a statement that you could hear from somebody who is experiencing post-traumatic growth. The main thing that they are taking out of it is, I almost died. Now I should reevaluate what's happening with my life. But that could happen if they almost died in a tornado, they almost died from cancer, they almost died from any other aspect that was life-threatening. Somebody else says, when I lost my best friend, my world ended. That is more post-suicidal. They're reflecting on the specific thing that made an impact on their quality of life. Stronger than I thought might just be post-traumatic growth, and these symptoms bother me the most is post-suicidal growth. So go back then to the quality of life and hope compared to suicide. I'm just checking my time. We start with the status quo, and then we look at growth. This would be if somebody had no suicidal experience at all, and they were just trying to become healthier, learn some new things in their life, how to meditate or learn more about spirituality. The possibility of suicide, quality of life has completely dropped. Recovery, they get back up to their status quo, they're good with that, and keep going. And then our last option is that post-traumatic growth. They dip down, they have that pivot that has occurred, so they're able to go back up towards their original quality of life. But then after hitting that, they take something more from it. They find the meaning in that. They find a purpose in it. And that sense of meaning and purpose then leads to them having growth beyond that. So here's kind of the bottom line for why this is important for suicide prevention. Here's the amount of risk that somebody had when they are at their start, their status quo. They would have to drop this far in order to feel like life is absolutely not worth it, and they should die. If we catch them at this point and we keep them there, we've stopped them from falling farther down, but now they still have that aspect of risk that is lower than when they started, because we've solved the crisis, so we stopped them from moving down. But at that point, if we've just done the crisis intervention, we haven't brought it back up. If you go to recovery, then we are at least back to where we started from. We have now recovered far enough so that they have the same amount of protection that they did before the suicidal crisis ever happened. But then if you look at the last one, with the post-traumatic growth, they're now higher up on quality of life than when they started, which takes them farther away from being at the suicide. The more they have had recovery and growth, the farther away from becoming suicidal. So then if you combine that then with the idea of resilience being quick recovery, you can see that having a recovery and growth perspective takes them farther and farther and farther away from having such a significant dip that they attempt suicide. Because even if there is a dip, there's farther to go, and even if they go down pretty far, they can recover fast. So then let's talk about safety and growth planning. And this is one way that I bring it back to safety planning as being something that's an ongoing aspect, something to review. At the first point, we have warning signs. And our growth plan one is to look at those and figure out the needs, the values, and the strength. It's that post-suicidal growth aspect of examining the crisis. Now that we are already looking at the individual warning signs, what can we learn from this? What can we extract from it? We have some initial coping strategies. And then we look at ways to improve coping, new skills that can be added onto that. What were the things that were already missing? What would have helped? Now, as we're doing this process, you're revising the original safety plan because you're adding in new things that can now go into the safety plan. That has two benefits. One is that you're adding new things. The other one, though, is that you're reviewing the safety plan again. So it's not going to be something that just sits on the shelf. It's not going to be something that sits in a person's back pocket and never gets pulled out again. It's not going to be something that goes into our file. Instead, it's going to be something that comes back out. You're reviewing it. It has an iteration of improving. And that helps their quality and use over time, which is what we've seen in the research as being the main thing that drives how effective safety planning is at keeping somebody from being suicidal. At first, we looked at their social situations, mostly as distraction, who can help in just keeping the person from thinking about suicide at all. On the growth side, we look at ways to improve their social connections. And again, we're improving on what we initially thought of for social distractions. Now, another reason why this is really important to go back to is because if the initial one was made when somebody is leaving the emergency department, where they're at a state of crisis or just coming out of crisis, where they're depressed, they're unlikely to remember all of the great things about life that they could hold on to. They're less likely to be able to remember all the coping strategies that they had learned before, all the people that they could count on. So if we only rely on the safety plan that was created as somebody was leaving the emergency department or as somebody was brand new recovering, we're probably going to be missing a whole lot that could go in there that could be beneficial for them the next time they might experience a crisis. We looked at people who could help in a crisis, and now we look at people who can help with growth. We looked at professional help, and now we look at professional resources for growth. And finally, we looked at the safe environment, and now we look at creating a wellness environment. The other thing I like about having both the safety plan and the growth plan is how much it reintegrates somebody into the community. Let's say you're talking about a school, right? Not every teacher or coach or parent or guardian is going to be really good at doing crisis response. We can train them. We can have them sit through gatekeeper programs or provide them with information, and some of them are going to be really good at it, and others not so much. However, right, some teachers and coaches and ministers and others are excellent at promoting growth, promoting wellness, promoting values, helping people to get energized into the wellness domain. This brings them back into the whole plan. It helps with their whole person recovery and growth, because now you're bringing in those community resources that were there before crisis. You're bringing in the community resources you would have had if you had started with the person never becoming suicidal. Just because somebody has had a suicidal crisis doesn't mean you give up on their growth. You bring back the exercises, you bring back the potentials that they had for wellness once they have already hit that recovery period. And this allows us to reincorporate any counseling or any possible resources that we had that we would be recommending for all of our students or all of our youth or all of the people that we work with. And it brings all of our crisis resources matched up now with the growth resources. And for the safe environment, wellness environment, there was the case study that was presented in the initial article on safety planning talked about the person having a firearm in the home. And so the reduced access to lethal means all revolved around restricting access to that firearm, which is an extremely important aspect of it, as I mentioned earlier, right? Restriction to firearm definitely has made a difference for me, which is why I will never own a firearm. However, in the process of interviewing this person and finding out what was going on with him, the case also mentioned some things like his kids were a protective factor. He had prior work with, I think he was with Alcoholics Anonymous. And he had some other things as well that were possible protective factors. So in addition to taking away the firearm, what if we added more pictures of his kids? What if we added more things that reminded him of life? Things that reminded him of things that he had to hold on to, or things that he thought were important, things that matched up with his values. Then we have both aspects going. We have the reduction of risk, and we also have pushing them north, pushing them back towards life. And with that, we have much stronger suicide prevention because we've incorporated both. Someone asked earlier where faith programs might fit in with suicide prevention, in my perspective. I think we have some really good faith programs now that deal with suicide prevention. I know I've been part of some, and I know that there are more being developed, and there were some really great resources that were shared this morning related to faith. There are also so many programs out there that are for youth development and for life skills that can be used on that professional growth side. So we can reincorporate a lot of the things that we might not have thought of as being the suicide prevention stuff, because we usually think perhaps more linearly, right? So that we have wellness promotion, prevention, and then we go to what's indicated. But we can also bring back the other stuff. So I had been working with a therapist in Fresno for a while, and she had the fortunate situation of being with somebody who knew a lot about suicide prevention, and also the unfortunate circumstance of being with somebody who knew a lot about suicide prevention. Because we both knew that if I decided absolutely that I wanted to die, there would be nothing that could stop me. I knew all the ins and outs. The only thing that made a sense to work on at that point then is the life side, strengthening that life side. And that's what has made the biggest difference. Until then, I had gone through years and years of medication and therapy that did well at managing symptoms and on keeping me from attempting suicide again, but hadn't really grounded me in life. So that's what we worked on instead. Once we had that agreement in place. There was also some means restriction, right? I had put together a kit, we'll say. And at one point, I was able to just bring it in, have her hold on to it. And that just at least took it out of sight and out of mind. In place of it, though, we decided to create a kit with the same level of planning and detail and thoughtfulness that worked in the life direction. And I love individualizing things so that they are more meaningful to each person. So as a quick example, we talk about putting weapons into a lockbox or with a trigger lock on them. But for the person who was in that case study, what if beyond just putting the weapon in a lockbox, he put a picture of his kids on the lockbox? So that not only did it stop him from going, but it would immediately remind him of his strongest reason for living. That kind of individualized attention, I think, is something that can make a difference, even if it's in that few minutes that could stop somebody from taking that urgent action. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.